Dualism. You stub your toe on a chair and it hurts. But what's actually feeling that pain? Is it just your brain firing signals? Or is there something more, something non-physical, like a mind or a soul? That's where dualism comes in. Dualism is the idea that reality is made up of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff: physical and mental, the body and the mind, the brain and the consciousness. According to this view, your thoughts, memories, and emotions aren't just brain chemistry. They belong to a separate, non-material mind. The most famous version of this idea comes from 17th century philosopher René Descartes. He argued that the body is like a machine, made of matter, operating under physical laws, while the mind is something else entirely, invisible, indivisible, and capable of thought. In his view, the mind and body interact, but they aren't the same thing. To make that clearer, think of a driver and a car. The car moves, accelerates, and stops. But it doesn't make decisions. That's the driver's job. In dualism, the body is like the car, and the mind is the driver. But dualism raises tough questions. If the mind is non-physical, how does it control the body? How does an immaterial thought cause a hand to move? That puzzle, called the mind-body problem, has challenged philosophers for centuries. Even today, dualist ideas show up in everyday thinking. We talk about bodies and souls, or we say someone is trapped in their mind. And despite advances in neuroscience, the question of whether the mind is just the brain or something more remains open. Dualism doesn't try to explain everything. It simply starts with a basic observation. The mental and the physical feel different. From there, it builds one of the most enduring theories in philosophy. Materialism, the phone in your hand, the thoughts in your head, even the emotions you feel. According to materialism, they're all made of the same thing: matter. Materialism is the philosophical idea that everything that exists is physical. That includes objects like tables and trees, but also things we usually think of as non-physical, like consciousness, memories, and imagination. Under materialism, these aren't separate from the body. They're the result of physical processes, especially in the brain. This idea traces back to ancient thinkers like Democritus, who believed everything was made of tiny particles, what we now call atoms. But materialism really took off with the rise of modern science, as physics, chemistry, and biology explained more about how the world works. Materialism offered a powerful framework. If it can be measured, observed, or caused by physical forces, it's real. In a materialist view, your mind is not a mysterious force floating above your body. It's what your brain does when it processes information. Just like a computer runs programs using electrical circuits, your thoughts and feelings emerge from neurons firing and chemicals interacting. Of course, materialism comes with challenges. One big question is consciousness. How can a lump of grey matter produce thoughts, sensations, and awareness? Some argue materialism hasn't yet explained this fully. Others believe it's just a matter of time and better science. Materialism has shaped much of modern science and technology. It's the basis for neuroscience, psychology, and even artificial intelligence. If everything can be explained in physical terms, it means we can study, predict, and maybe even replicate the mind itself. At its core, materialism is a simple idea with massive implications. The universe runs on physical laws, and everything we are, including the parts that feel the most personal, follows those laws too. Pluralism. Not everything can be explained by one single idea. Sometimes reality is just too complex for that. That's the basic starting point of pluralism. In philosophy, pluralism is the view that reality isn't made of just one kind of thing or reducible to a single principle. Instead, it's made of many kinds of things, each with its own nature and importance. It stands in contrast to monism, which says everything comes from one fundamental source, like matter or mind. Pluralism says, no, that's too simple. The world is made up of many layers, and they all matter. The idea can be traced back to ancient philosophers like Empedocles, who argued that everything was made not from one basic element, but from four: earth, air, fire, and water. Fast forward to modern philosophy, and pluralism is still around, just in more developed forms. Pluralists believe that reducing everything to just one substance or explanation, whether physical atoms, mental experiences, or anything else, misses how diverse and rich reality actually is. For example, you can't fully explain a painting by just talking about the paint. You also need psychology, culture, intention, emotion. Each offers a valid piece of the puzzle, and together they give a fuller picture. In ethics, political theory, and science, pluralism shows up as a kind of built-in flexibility. It says there can be multiple valid systems, values, or perspectives, not because everything is subjective, but because the world itself is complex enough to support more than one truth at a time. Philosophical pluralism reminds us that we don't have to choose just one lens to understand reality. Sometimes multiple answers can all be right, each one unlocking a different side of the same complicated world. Epistemology. Most of what you believe, you didn't discover for yourself. You heard it, read it, or were told, and decided it was probably true. But how do you know it's true? That's where epistemology comes in. It's the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, what it is, how we get it, and how we can be sure we actually have it. Start with the basics. To say you know something, three things usually need to be true. First, the belief has to be correct. Second, you have to believe it. And third, you need a good reason for believing it. That last part, justification, is what separates knowledge from a lucky guess. Imagine someone randomly picks a lottery number and wins. They guessed right, but they didn't really know. In contrast, if a meteorologist uses weather data to predict rain tomorrow, and it does rain, that's closer to knowledge. It's not just a guess, it's a belief backed by evidence. Epistemology also explores where knowledge comes from. Some philosophers argue that we're born with certain truths already built in. Others say all knowledge comes from experience. Then there are questions about memory, perception, and even language, since most of what we know is passed down from others. The field also tackles skepticism. How can we trust what our senses tell us when illusions and false memories exist? And how do we know that the world outside our mind actually matches how we experience it? Epistemology doesn't always offer easy answers, but it lays the groundwork for understanding what counts as a reliable belief. In a world full of information, misinformation, and uncertainty, that kind of clarity is more important than ever. Rationalism. You don't need to see a triangle to know it has three sides. Some things we just seem to know by thinking. That's the starting point of rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophical view that reason is the primary source of knowledge. It claims that certain truths can be known independently of experience, just by using logic, thought, and deduction. In other words, not everything we know comes from the senses. This idea stands in contrast to empiricism, which says that knowledge comes mainly from observation and experience. Rationalists argue that while experience is useful, it isn't the foundation of all knowledge. That's a truth you can grasp through reasoning alone. Rationalist thinkers believe that the mind contains certain basic ideas or structures from birth. These are often called innate ideas. Examples include concepts like quantity, identity, or even cause and effect. You don't learn them from the outside world. They're already built into how you think. One of the most famous rationalists, René Descartes, used pure reasoning to try to establish certainty. He started by doubting everything, including his senses, and worked his way up using logical steps. The idea was that reason could build a solid foundation for knowledge, even when experience might be misleading. Rationalism has had a huge influence on science, mathematics, and philosophy. It supports the idea that the mind is not just a passive receiver of information, but an active tool for discovering truth. By relying on reason, rationalism helps explain how we understand things that go beyond immediate experience, things that are abstract, universal, and often essential to how we make sense of the world. Solipsism: everything you've ever seen, heard, touched, or thought about has passed through your mind. So what if none of it exists outside your own head? That's the unsettling idea behind solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only your own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, other people, the outside world, even your own body, might just be part of your consciousness. Not because you're imagining it on purpose, but because there's no way to prove that anything beyond your thoughts is real. The reasoning starts with a simple fact. All your experiences come through your own perspective. You don't have direct access to other people's thoughts or sensations. You see someone smile, but you can't feel what they feel. You hear a sound, but it's always processed by your own senses. From this viewpoint, the world could be a kind of mental simulation, something your mind creates moment by moment. Solipsism isn't saying that everyone else is fake, or that the world definitely isn't real. It's just pointing out that we have no way to be absolutely sure. Every bit of evidence you could use to prove otherwise, sight, sound, logic, still comes from within your own mind. It's like trying to step outside of your own shadow. This idea is more than just a thought experiment. It connects to deeper questions in epistemology and consciousness studies. Philosophers use solipsism to explore the limits of knowledge and how we define what's real. It also highlights a central challenge in philosophy, figuring out how we can know anything beyond our own experience. Even though few people actually believe in solipsism, the idea itself forces philosophy to be more careful about its assumptions. It reminds us that the line between certainty and belief is thinner than it looks. Phenomenalism. When you leave a room, do the objects inside still exist? Phenomenalism says that's not the right question, because things don't exist independently of experience. They exist as possibilities of perception. Phenomenalism is a philosophical view that connects the existence of physical objects directly to sensory experience. According to this idea, to say that something exists is really just to say that it could be experienced under the right conditions. If no one is experiencing it, its existence still depends on how it would appear if someone were there to observe it. For example, imagine a book sitting on a shelf. Even if no one is in the room, phenomenalism holds that the book still exists, because if someone were to walk in, they would see it, touch it, or even hear it fall. Its reality is defined by the experiences it could produce, not by something separate or hidden behind them. This idea gained traction in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially among philosophers, trying to make sense of how we talk about things we aren't currently sensing. Phenomenalism avoids saying objects have a mysterious existence out there. Instead, it treats talk about objects as shorthand for patterns of potential experiences. One advantage of phenomenalism is that it avoids some of the problems raised by skepticism. Since it doesn't rely on a world beyond experience, it doesn't need to prove that world exists. Everything meaningful is grounded in what can be observed, or at least what could be observed. Phenomenalism reshapes how we think about reality. It doesn't deny the world. It just shifts the focus from invisible matter to observable moments, turning physical objects into bundles of sensory possibilities rather than independent things. Foundationalism. When building a house, you start with a foundation. Without it, everything else risks collapsing. Foundationalism applies that same idea to knowledge. Foundationalism is a theory in epistemology that says all of our beliefs are built on a base of basic, self-justified beliefs. These foundational beliefs don't rely on other beliefs to be considered valid. They're seen as secure starting points. From there, more complex beliefs are built on top, layer by layer. The structure is often imagined like a pyramid. At the bottom are beliefs that are considered obvious or undeniable. Things like, I exist, or I'm in pain. These are beliefs you can hold without needing further proof. On top of those, you build beliefs about the world, science, history, and everything else. This idea became especially important during the rise of modern philosophy. Thinkers like René Descartes were searching for certainty. Descartes famously doubted everything he could until he arrived at one belief he thought couldn't be doubted: that he was thinking. That, he believed, was a foundation strong enough to build upon. In foundationalism, justification moves upward. Higher-level beliefs, like the idea that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, are supported by more basic ones, like sensory observations and logical reasoning. The goal is to avoid circular reasoning, where beliefs only support each other without any secure base. Critics argue that finding truly foundational beliefs is harder than it sounds. What feels obvious to one person might not be obvious to another. Still, foundationalism has been influential in shaping how we understand knowledge and certainty. At its core, foundationalism is an attempt to ground human understanding on something firm, starting with beliefs that can stand on their own, and using them to support everything else we claim to know. Logic. If you say all cats are mammals and your pet is a cat, then it has to be a mammal. That's logic. Clean, simple, and hard to argue with. Logic is the branch of philosophy that studies the rules of correct reasoning. It helps us figure out which arguments make sense and which ones fall apart. Instead of focusing on what we believe, logic looks at how we think and whether our conclusions follow from our starting points. At its most basic level, logic deals with statements and their relationships. If one thing is true, what else must be true because of it? This structure is what makes logical thinking so powerful. It creates chains of reasoning that are clear, predictable, and testable. There are different types of logic, but the two most common are deductive and inductive. Deductive logic starts with general principles and applies them to specific cases. For example, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the starting points are true, the conclusion has to be true. Inductive logic works the other way. It looks at patterns in specific examples to form general conclusions, like noticing that the sun rises every morning and concluding that it probably will tomorrow too. Inductive reasoning isn't as certain as deduction, but it's useful for everyday decision-making and science. Modern logic also includes symbolic systems, ways to represent arguments using symbols and formulas, much like math. These tools help break down complex reasoning into simpler parts, especially when evaluating abstract ideas. Logic doesn't tell us what's true, but it tells us what follows from what. It's the backbone of rational thought, and one of philosophy's most precise tools for separating good thinking from bad. Deduction. If all humans are mortal, and Socrates is a human, then Socrates must be mortal. That kind of reasoning is called deduction, and it's one of the clearest tools we have for figuring out what follows from what. Deduction is a type of logical thinking where you start with general rules and apply them to specific cases. If your starting points are true and your reasoning is valid, then your conclusion has to be true. It's not a guess or a probability, it's a guarantee, as long as everything is in order. This method has been used in philosophy and science for thousands of years. It helps clarify arguments, eliminate contradictions, and build airtight conclusions from solid foundations. In a way, it's like a chain reaction. Once the first links are locked in place, everything else naturally follows. Deductive reasoning is especially useful in formal systems like mathematics. If you know that all squares are rectangles, and you know that this shape is a square, then you can confidently say it's also a rectangle. You're not checking reality, you're working through definitions and rules. But deduction has limits. It depends entirely on the truth of its premises. If your starting points are wrong, the conclusion might still be logically valid, but it won't reflect the real world. For example, if someone says, "All fish can fly," goldfish are fish, therefore goldfish can fly, the logic holds. But the first statement doesn't. That's why deduction is often paired with observation-based reasoning, like induction. One gives structure, the other gives input. Together they help form a fuller picture of how we reason, argue, and understand. Deduction offers a powerful framework for thinking clearly. It's about taking what we know and following it to where it logically leads. No shortcuts, just straight reasoning. Abduction. You walk into your kitchen and see water on the floor. You didn't see it spill, but you notice the dog's bowl is tipped over. So you guess the dog probably did it. That's abduction, figuring out the most likely explanation from what you know. Abduction, also known as inference to the best explanation, is a form of reasoning where we start with an observation and then try to come up with the most plausible cause. Unlike deduction, which guarantees a conclusion if the premises are true, and unlike induction, which draws patterns from repeated cases, abduction is about picking the explanation that fits best, even if it's not certain. This kind of thinking is common in everyday life. If your phone isn't charging, you might assume the cable is broken. You haven't tested everything yet, but based on past experience, it seems like the most reasonable explanation. Doctors use abduction when diagnosing symptoms. Detectives use it when piecing together clues. It's how we move from confusing situations to coherent stories. The term was introduced by American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. He believed that abduction plays a key role in the way we form new ideas. It's often the first step in problem solving, what gets us from scattered evidence to a working theory. Of course, abduction isn't foolproof. The best explanation might not always be the correct one, but it's a practical way of reasoning when time, information, or certainty is limited. It helps us make sense of the unknown by filling in the blanks with what seems most likely. Abduction is what drives us to ask, "What's going on here?" and then come up with a smart guess. It's the thinking behind insights, discoveries, and those everyday moments when something just clicks. Paradox. If a barber shaves everyone in town who doesn't shave themselves, who shaves the barber? That's a paradox, a situation where logic seems to break down, even though every step seems to make sense. In philosophy, a paradox is a statement or situation that leads to a contradiction or a result that defies common sense. It often arises when two or more seemingly reasonable ideas clash, making it difficult, or sometimes impossible, to figure out what's actually true. Paradoxes come in different forms. Some are logical, like the liar paradox, where someone says, "This statement is false. If it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it must be true." Others are more practical, like Zeno's paradoxes, which argue that motion is impossible because you'd have to complete an infinite number of steps just to walk across a room. What makes paradoxes interesting is that they don't just confuse, they reveal. A good paradox doesn't just show a flaw in thinking, it points to limits in the way we define concepts, use language, or apply logic. They force us to rethink what we thought we understood. Philosophers use paradoxes as tools. They help test the strength of arguments, expose assumptions, and refine definitions. In science and math, paradoxes have even led to breakthroughs. Russell's paradox, for example, exposed problems in early set theory and helped shape modern logic. Paradoxes aren't problems to be solved and forgotten. They're puzzles that sharpen thinking. By challenging us to hold two conflicting ideas at once, they show how complex and layered our understanding of reality really is. They might not always have a clear answer, but they always leave us thinking more carefully about the questions we ask. Have you ever wondered why reality is exactly the way it is? Why do things exist at all, rather than nothing? These might sound like simple questions, but they're actually part of one of the oldest and deepest branches of philosophy, metaphysics. Metaphysics isn't as complicated as it sounds. At its core, it's simply the study of reality itself. It goes beyond physics or science, asking fundamental questions about existence. Where science explains how things happen, metaphysics asks what existence itself really is. This type of thinking started with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Interestingly, the word metaphysics originally just meant after physics, because Aristotle wrote about these ideas right after he wrote about physical things like motion and matter. But over time, the term took on a deeper meaning, becoming philosophy's attempt to understand the ultimate nature of reality. Metaphysics covers two main areas. The first is called ontology, which tries to classify everything that exists. Ontologists explore whether abstract ideas, like beauty, goodness, or numbers, are real things or just concepts we create in our minds. For example, does the idea of redness exist by itself? Or is it only real because we see red objects? The second area deals with more personal, relatable questions about existence. Things like the nature of our minds and consciousness, free will, or even whether anything exists beyond the physical world. These questions aren't easy, but they shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Even though metaphysics doesn't always offer concrete answers like science, it pushes our understanding deeper. It reminds us that behind everyday life is an incredible mystery, existence itself. And that's what makes metaphysics fascinating. It doesn't require you to be a philosopher. It simply invites you to look a little closer at the reality around you. Osh. Everything we see, trees, oceans, stars, even our own thoughts, has to come from somewhere. But what if you asked, what's the first thing, the real beginning of everything? That's exactly what the ancient Greeks were trying to figure out when they came up with the idea of aperture. Aperture means the fundamental substance or principle that everything else comes from. Think of it like this. If the universe were a building, aperture would be the raw material it was made from, the bricks, the beams, the foundation. Different early philosophers had different ideas about what that first substance could be. Thales, one of the earliest thinkers, believed everything came from water, not because everything's wet, but because he saw water everywhere. Rivers, rain, even in our bodies. To him, it made sense as a unifying ingredient. Others disagreed. Anaximenes said it was air. Heraclitus went with fire, and Anaximander argued it wasn't any known substance, but something more abstract, an infinite, formless source he called the apeiron. These weren't just random guesses. They were attempts to explain the entire universe using logic and observation, long before modern science existed. In fact, these early ideas eventually laid the groundwork for physics and cosmology. The aperture was a way of saying, let's find the root of reality, not through stories or myths, but by thinking deeply. Even now, scientists and philosophers are still asking versions of the same question. What is everything made of? Where did it all start? Aperture may be an ancient idea, but it points to something timeless, the drive to understand the very beginning of everything we know. Ontology. What actually counts as real? A rock, a tree, your phone. Those seem obvious. But what about things like time, numbers, or love? Do they exist in the same way? This is exactly what ontology tries to figure out. It's a branch of philosophy that focuses on one big question: what exists? Ontology is a part of metaphysics, and it deals with the most basic categories of being. It doesn't just ask what things are made of, it asks what kinds of things can exist at all. For example, it wants to know if everything in the world is made up of physical objects, or if abstract things, like ideas or emotions, should also be considered part of reality. A key idea in ontology is the distinction between particulars and universals. Particulars are individual things, like your specific cat or this specific chair. Universals, on the other hand, are general qualities that many things can share, like redness or softness. Ontologists debate whether universals are real things or just useful labels we attach to objects. Ontology also tackles questions about identity. If you replace all the parts of a ship one by one, is it still the same ship? That's not just a puzzle. It's an ontological issue about persistence and change over time. Modern ontology has even made its way into technology. In computer science and AI, an ontology is a structured framework used to represent knowledge. It helps systems understand how different pieces of data relate to each other. At its core, ontology is about building a map of reality. It helps us sort the world into categories that make sense, even when things aren't as straightforward as they first seem. And in doing that, it quietly shapes how we think about everything that exists. Monism. Most of us see the world as a collection of separate things. People, animals, buildings, objects. Everything seems divided. But there's an ancient idea that flips this view completely on its head. It's called monism, and it claims that everything is, in fact, one. Monism comes from the Greek word for single. In philosophy, it's the belief that all of reality, everything you see, feel, think, is made of just one fundamental substance or principle. That might sound abstract, but it's actually pretty simple at its core. Instead of thinking there's mind and matter or body and soul, monism says, no, it's all just one thing, appearing in different forms. There are different kinds of monism. Some versions say everything is physical, what we'd call material monism. Others claim everything is mental, like one giant consciousness. This is known as idealist monism. And then there's neutral monism, which says the universe isn't mental or physical. It's something else entirely, something more basic that gives rise to both. To get a feel for monism, imagine a wave in the ocean. You can point to a wave and say it's a thing, but it's still just ocean, shaped differently for a moment. That's the monist view of you, me, everything. We're not separate things, just temporary patterns in a single, endless whole. This idea isn't just a thought experiment. It shaped entire cultures, from Eastern philosophies like Advaita Vedanta to modern physics debates about the fabric of reality. It challenges how we see ourselves and what we think the world really is. Monism doesn't ask you to stop seeing differences. It invites you to look deeper and notice what might be hiding underneath all of them. Unity. Idealism. When you close your eyes, the world seems to disappear. But what if it actually does? That's the strange and fascinating idea at the heart of idealism. In philosophy, idealism is the theory that reality is fundamentally mental. In other words, everything we call real, objects, space, even time, is actually built from ideas or experiences in the mind. According to idealists, the physical world doesn't exist independently of perception. It only exists because it's being observed, thought about, or experienced. One of the most famous versions of this idea comes from George Berkeley, an 18th century philosopher. He argued that what we call matter doesn't exist on its own. For example, a tree isn't a physical object sitting out there waiting to be seen. Instead, the tree exists because it's being perceived by you, by others, or by some higher mind. To Berkeley, being is the same as being perceived. This sounds counterintuitive. After all, we think of the world as something solid and independent, but idealism pushes back on that assumption. Think about a dream. While you're in it, it feels real. The people, places, and events all seem to have shape and space, but none of it exists outside your mind. Idealists suggest that waking life might be similar, just more consistent and shared. There are different forms of idealism. Some say everything is made of consciousness. Others argue that reality is shaped by the structures of thought itself, like a built-in lens our minds use to interpret the world. What they all share is the belief that the mind isn't just part of reality, it's the foundation of it. Idealism challenges the way we define what's real. It flips the usual perspective, suggesting that ideas aren't floating above the material world. They are the material world. Atomism. Everything around you, your phone, the air, your body, even light, is made up of tiny pieces too small to see. That basic idea sits at the heart of atomism, one of the oldest philosophical theories about the nature of reality. Atomism is the belief that everything in the universe is made of tiny, indivisible units called atoms. These atoms are not the same as the ones studied in modern chemistry, but the concept goes back over 2,000 years to ancient Greece. Philosophers like Leucippus and Democritus proposed that the world isn't continuous or smooth, but built from countless small particles moving through empty space. According to classical atomism, atoms are eternal, solid, and unchangeable. They differ in shape and size, and their combinations create everything we see: rocks, plants, animals, even fire and water. Change doesn't come from anything disappearing or appearing out of nowhere. It's simply atoms rearranging into new forms. This view was radical for its time. It rejected ideas based on mythology or mysterious forces. Atomists believed the universe operated by natural laws, not the whims of gods. They were early champions of a mechanical, law-governed cosmos. a mindset that would later influence science during the Enlightenment. What makes atomism important isn't just the idea of tiny particles, it's the shift in thinking it represents. Atomism was one of the first attempts to explain the world using reason, logic, and observation rather than stories or tradition. Modern physics has, of course, advanced far beyond ancient atomism. Atoms, as we know them today, are made of even smaller parts. But the core insight, that complex things can be broken down into simpler components, remains a foundation of how we understand the physical world. Atomism was philosophy's first serious step towards science. Realism. A tree falls in a forest, no one hears it. According to realism, it still fell, and it's still there. Realism, in philosophy, is the idea that the world exists independently of our thoughts, perceptions, or beliefs. In simple terms, things don't need us to notice them in order to be real. Whether or not someone is around to observe a mountain, a planet, or a pile of sand, those things still exist, just as they are. This might sound like common sense, but not all philosophical views agree. Some theories suggest that reality is shaped by our minds or experiences. Realism pushes back. It claims that facts about the world are objective. They don't shift based on who's looking or how they feel. There are different versions of realism depending on the topic. In metaphysics, realism says that physical objects exist outside of our awareness. In science, it holds that theories describe real things, like electrons or gravitational waves, even if we can't observe them directly. In ethics, moral realism argues that some actions are truly right or wrong, no matter what society thinks. One of the big debates in realism involves abstract concepts. For example, take the number 7. You can't touch it or see it like a rock, but it's used in math, physics, and engineering every day. So the question is, does 7 exist in some real way? Or is it just a useful mental tool? Realists often say it exists, even if not in a physical form. What makes realism powerful is its steady confidence that reality is out there, structured, discoverable, and not entirely up to us. It's a foundation for science, logic, and most of the ways we try to understand the world. Skepticism. You see the sun rise, your feet touch the floor, and the news tells you what's happening in the world. It all feels certain. But skepticism asks a blunt question. How do you actually know any of it is real? In philosophy, skepticism is the view that we should doubt or suspend judgment about what we think we know. It doesn't claim that nothing is true. It just challenges the idea that we can be completely sure of anything, especially when our knowledge depends on perception, memory, or testimony. One of the earliest skeptics, Pyrrho of Elis, believed that because our senses can deceive us, we should withhold belief. If things can look different from different angles or under different conditions, how can we trust any single experience? Take a basic example. You put a straight stick in water and it looks bent. Your eyes tell you one thing, but your reasoning tells you another. Skeptics use cases like this to show that perception isn't always reliable. And if we can't fully trust our senses, then anything built on them, like science, history, or even daily experience, becomes less certain. Modern skepticism goes even further. Some versions ask how we know we're not dreaming, or trapped in a computer simulation. Others point out that even our logical reasoning could be flawed, since it depends on assumptions that can't be proven without using reasoning itself. Still, skepticism isn't about giving up on knowledge. It's about setting a high standard for what counts as knowing. It pushes philosophy to be more careful, more precise, and more honest about the limits of what we can claim. In that sense, skepticism isn't the enemy of truth. It's a tool for testing it. Empiricism. You know fire is hot because you felt it. You know sugar is sweet because you've tasted it. These aren't ideas you were born with. They came from experience. That's the core idea behind empiricism. Empiricism is the philosophical view that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. It says we're not born knowing things. We start with a blank slate, and everything we learn comes from what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. This idea directly challenges rationalism, which claims that some knowledge is built into the mind. Empiricists push back, arguing that without experience, even the most basic concepts wouldn't exist. You don't know what cold is until you've felt it. You don't understand blue unless you've seen it. The roots of empiricism go back to thinkers like John Locke, who described the mind at birth as a blank sheet of paper. For Locke, experience writes on that paper over time, through direct observation and reflection. Later philosophers like George Berkeley and David Hume developed the idea further, showing how everything from complex ideas to moral beliefs could be traced back to experience. Empiricism also laid the foundation for the modern scientific method. Instead of relying on pure logic or intuition, scientists observe, measure, and test. They build knowledge by gathering data and repeating experiments. That method reflects the core belief of empiricism, that truth starts with what we can observe. Of course, empiricism isn't just about science. It shapes how we think about learning, memory, perception, and even how we trust information. By grounding knowledge in experience, empiricism builds a framework for understanding the world through the evidence it gives us, one sense at a time. Pragmatism. If an idea works in real life, then maybe that's all the truth it needs. That's the core idea behind pragmatism. Pragmatism is a school of philosophy that focuses on the practical consequences of beliefs. Instead of asking whether something is abstractly true, pragmatists ask whether it's useful. If a belief helps you solve problems, make predictions, or get through life more effectively, then it has value, and that might be enough to count as knowledge. This approach was developed in the late 1800s by American philosophers like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. They weren't interested in truth as something fixed and eternal. Instead, they saw it as something that could evolve, depending on how well it holds up in real situations. In pragmatism, a belief is like a tool. Take the idea that germs cause disease. That belief is accepted not because it sounds elegant or fits a grand theory, but because it leads to effective treatments, vaccines, and healthier lives. The belief is considered true because it works. Pragmatism also applies to moral and social issues. For example, rather than debating whether justice has a perfect definition, a pragmatist might ask which policies or actions lead to a more fair and stable society. The focus stays on results, not idealized concepts. One of the key strengths of pragmatism is flexibility. It doesn't demand that ideas be perfect, just useful enough to make a difference. And if they stop working, pragmatism has no problem letting them go. By measuring truth through outcomes, pragmatism blends philosophy with real-world thinking. It treats ideas less like sacred answers and more like strategies, tools we test, refine, and keep using only as long as they help us navigate the world. Coherentism. Most people think a belief is justified if it rests on solid evidence. But what if there's no ultimate starting point, just a web of beliefs supporting each other? That's the idea behind coherentism. Coherentism is a theory in epistemology, the study of knowledge. It suggests that beliefs are justified not because they rest on a single foundational truth, but because they fit together in a consistent and logical system. In other words, a belief is reasonable if it makes sense within the bigger picture of everything else you believe. Think of it like a puzzle. One piece doesn't prove the picture is right, but if all the pieces connect and form a clear image, you trust the result. In coherentism, knowledge works the same way. Individual beliefs gain strength by how well they mesh with the rest of the system. This view stands in contrast to foundationalism, which says knowledge should rest on a firm base of self-evident truths or direct experiences. Coherentists argue that no belief stands completely alone. Even things we take for granted, like what we see or remember, are interpreted through our background beliefs. A simple example might help. Suppose you believe your friend is at home because their lights are on. Their car is in the driveway, and they said they'd be home earlier. Each of those observations supports the idea, but none of them prove it on their own. The belief becomes stronger because all the details fit together. Coherentism doesn't guarantee absolute certainty, but that's not the goal. Instead, it focuses on building a network of beliefs that reinforce each other, like a well-balanced structure. The more tightly connected and internally consistent your beliefs are, the more justified they become, at least within that system. Constructivism. No one is born knowing what a country is, what money means, or how traffic lights work. These things aren't found in nature. They're built by people. That's the basic idea behind constructivism. Constructivism is the philosophical view that knowledge and meaning are not simply discovered, they're constructed. According to this idea, we don't just passively absorb facts from the world. Instead, we actively shape what we know based on our experiences, social interactions, and cultural background. At its core, constructivism focuses on how human beings create frameworks for understanding reality. For example, the concept of time isn't experienced the same way across all cultures. Some treat it as linear, others as circular. The way we talk about time, measure it, or even feel it is shaped by the systems we live in, not something hardwired into our minds. In education, constructivism has had a major impact. Rather than seeing students as empty containers to be filled with information, this approach sees them as participants who build understanding through exploration and context. Learning isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about making connections based on what someone already knows. In science and ethics, constructivism pushes the idea that what we accept as truth or morality is often shaped by history, language, or shared beliefs. Even scientific models are not perfect mirrors of reality. They're tools we've built to make sense of it. Constructivism doesn't mean anything goes. It still values evidence and logic, but it reminds us that human understanding is always filtered through a lens, shaped by how we think, communicate, and live. By emphasizing the role of the human mind in creating meaning, constructivism shifts focus from what the world is to how we come to understand it in the first place. Dialectics. When two people strongly disagree, it's easy to assume only one of them can be right. But in philosophy, disagreement can be the starting point for progress. That's where dialectics comes in. Dialectics is a method of thinking and reasoning that focuses on resolving contradictions. Instead of treating opposing ideas as a problem, dialectics treats them as fuel, something that drives development, learning, and change. The basic structure of dialectics usually involves 3 stages. First, there's a starting idea or position, often called a thesis. Then comes a challenge to that idea, known as the antithesis. Finally, through the tension between the two, a new idea emerges, a synthesis. that combines elements of both and moves the conversation forward. This approach goes back to ancient Greece, especially in the dialogues of Socrates, who questioned people's beliefs through conversation to push them toward clearer thinking. But dialectics became more formalized with later thinkers like Hegel, who used it to explain how ideas evolve over time through conflict and resolution. Marx and Engels took the concept further, applying dialectics to history, politics, and economics. They argued that social change happens through class struggle, another kind of contradiction, leading to new political and economic systems. This became known as dialectical materialism. Dialectics doesn't just apply to grand theories. You can see it in everyday life. For example, when two teammates disagree on how to solve a problem, they might argue, rethink, and eventually find a solution that's better than what either started with. That's dialectical thinking in action. At its core, dialectics is a tool for understanding how ideas develop through opposition. It values conflict not as something to avoid, but as something that helps us get to clearer, more complete understandings of the world. Induction. The sun has risen every day so far, so it's probably going to rise tomorrow. That's induction, reasoning from patterns to make general conclusions. Induction is a method of thinking where we observe specific examples and use them to form broader ideas. It doesn't guarantee certainty, but it helps us make educated guesses about what's likely to happen. This kind of reasoning plays a huge role in everyday life, science, and how we build knowledge from experience. The basic structure of induction looks like this. You notice a repeated pattern, and you draw a conclusion based on that pattern. For example, if you see that every time you water a plant it grows, you might conclude that watering helps plants grow. You don't have to test every plant on Earth. You assume the pattern will hold. Inductive reasoning is especially useful in science. Scientists run experiments, collect data, and then make general statements about how nature works. But induction isn't foolproof. Just because something has happened many times doesn't mean it always will. That's the core of the problem of induction, famously raised by philosopher David Hume. His point was that there's no logical guarantee that the future will always resemble the past. Still, despite its limits, induction is practical. We rely on it to make decisions, set expectations, and learn from experience. Weather forecasts, medical research, and even daily routines all use inductive logic. It's how we make sense of a world that's constantly changing and full of unknowns. Induction may not offer absolute certainty, but it gives us a way to move from observation to understanding. It's how we take what we've seen and turn it into something useful, an informed guess about what comes next. Fallibilism. Everyone makes mistakes. But what if that idea applied not just to people, but to knowledge itself? That's the central idea behind fallibilism. Fallibilism is the philosophical view that no belief or theory is ever completely immune to error. It doesn't mean everything is wrong. It just means that no matter how confident we are, there's always a chance we could be mistaken. Even our best knowledge is provisional, open to revision if better evidence comes along. The concept grew out of modern science and philosophy. Thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce and Karl Popper promoted the idea that knowledge should always remain flexible. In science, for example, a theory can be incredibly well supported by experiments and data. But scientists don't treat it as final truth. They treat it as the best current explanation until something better appears. Fallibilism pushes back against the idea that we can ever reach absolute certainty. Take something as everyday as using GPS. You follow the directions, assuming they're correct. But sometimes, the GPS is wrong. Fallibilism encourages that mindset on a larger scale. It reminds us that any belief, no matter how trusted, might need to change. This doesn't mean we should doubt everything all the time. Fallibilism is compatible with having strong beliefs, using evidence, and making decisions. But it also promotes intellectual humility, the willingness to admit we might be wrong and to keep an open mind when new information comes in. In philosophy, fallibilism challenges rigid systems that claim to offer final answers. Instead, it supports a view of knowledge as something we're constantly improving, refining, and sometimes correcting. It's not a weakness. It's a strategy for dealing with a complex world where certainty is rare and learning never really stops.